Hello everyone, and welcome back to Game Easy, Roll Good. This person asked for it, so I'm going to go ahead and start this series about all of the magic item changes in the 2024 Dungeon Master's Guide. I did a video previously about all the new items that are in the Dungeon Master's Guide, but I haven't really gone over any sort of changes to all the magic items, and I know basically most of the magic items were touched in some way. So this is going to be that series. I'm not going to do everything in one video. This might be spread out between maybe like 5 or 6 videos, depending on how it goes. I might not do all of these in a row. If there's something more interesting I want to talk about, I might interrupt this series, but I will include all of this in a playlist down below or on my channel page, so you can go look at that as well if you discover this at a later time and kind of want to watch them back to back. Real quick, if you are a new viewer to this channel or a returning viewer and you haven't hit that subscribe button yet and you like what you see here, please consider hitting the subscribe button either now or at some point during this video. But we're going to start with the magic items in alphabetical order. So let's go ahead and get started and see what we're working with. So first things first, we have the Adamantine Armor. There's nothing changed about the Adamantine Armor. Moving on to Adamantine Weapons. So these were added to the Dungeon Master's Guide from Xanathar's Guide to Everything. The 2014 Dungeon Master's Guide just had Adamantine Armor. It didn't have any call out for Adamantine Weapons. So notably, these are also listed under magic items, whereas in Xanathar's Guide to Everything, these were listed separately from the magic items. They were just like, oh, you can also have Adamantine Weapons. But now these are explicitly listed under the magic item section. So if it being considered a magic item would affect it in any way, it now falls under that category. And notably, because Adamantine Weapons automatically crit objects, that means that they would be especially good at breaking weapons and also possibly breaking armor, assuming that the armor isn't also made of adamantine, because again, adamantine armor can't be critically hit. I actually just released a video covering kind of all the rules that support breaking weapons and armor and things like that in 5th edition at least. So if you want to go take a look at that, I'll probably link that in the cards up here or down in the description down below. Moving on to the Alchemy Jug. First things first about the Alchemy Jug is that it is now a magic action to create liquid from an action. We're going to see a lot of that throughout the magic items, that things that were actions are now magic actions. It is now a utilize action to pour, whereas previously this was just a regular action. So notably for like thief rogues, for example, that can use the utilize action, part of their cunning action as a rogue, they could use this as a bonus action. And they also changed that the amount of basic poison was increased to 4 ounces from half an ounce. And notably 4 ounces is exactly the amount that it says a vial holds in the player's handbook in the adventuring gear. So basically, if you create the basic poison, that is enough for essentially 1 dose of poison. And so that would mean then that if by the 2014 rules, unless they changed the amount that a vial can hold in 2014, that you would have needed to use the Alchemy Jug for basic poison 8 days in a row in order to get 1 dose of poison. So kind of glad that they changed that. That's probably why they updated that number. But yeah, just an interesting change. Moving on to the Ammunition of Slaying. This was previously called the Arrow of Slaying, but now it is just called Ammunition of Slaying, and it can be applied to any sort of ammunition. Technically, in 2014, the description of this item, the Arrow of Slaying, said that it could be any type of ammunition, including a bolt or whatever it would be. But now that is more explicit in the name of it, as well as the categorization of it, where it says weapon and then in parentheses, any ammunition. They also now included a table for you if you wanted to randomly choose the monster, which you always could in 2014, but there wasn't a table for it before, so you kind of had to come up with one somehow, or like flip through the monster manual and just kind of blindly point at a monster and that it'd be that one. Or of course you can still choose which monster specifically is affected by it. Moving on to the +1, 2, and 3 ammunition. This is also unchanged. The Amulet of Health. This is also unchanged. For the Amulet of Proof against Detection and Location, this now says that you can't be targeted by divination spells rather than hidden from divination magic. We saw this change a lot with a lot of the spell changes in 2024 as well, like non-detection I think also has this language. And while that wording is changed, it's unclear if this is a nerf or a buff or if it's exactly the same thing. As far as I can tell, at least for this item, the end result is the same. Most scrying effects that I can think of, at least off the top of my head, basically all of them that I can think of off the top of my head, create some sort of scrying sensor in the location of that creature. So that would basically cover everything else. So overall, I think this is basically the same item. They just changed the language. However, it now also allows the wearer to opt into being targeted or perceived by such spells, whereas previously that text wasn't there. Moving on to the Amulet of the Plains. This, of course, now is a magic action to activate from just a regular action. It also now includes a random table for determining the results of a failure. So you have to make a DC 15 Intelligence Arcana check in order to successfully plane shift to a certain location. However, if you fail that check, you still move, but it is randomly selected as to where you go. It was always the case that you randomly went somewhere else if you failed the check, but now they have a specific table for it. And also now the results of 61 through 100 have more specific results, whereas previously it was a randomly determined plane of existence. resistance. So you can see 61 through 70, you go to a random location on an inner plane from one of the choices there. 71 through 80, outer plane. 81 through 90, you go to a different set of outer planes, and then 91 to 100, you end up in the astral plane or the astral sea. Then you can see here that in D&D Beyond, some of the tooltips are broken for whatever reason. So I included the names that were missing, the Beast Lands, the Abyss, and the Nine Hells. Moving on to the animated shield, it no longer states that it needs a command word to activate. You can just activate it as a bonus action. It also reiterates the rules for equipping and unequipping a shield, and it specifies that you must have proficiency in training with the shield to benefit from this item. I think this is one thing that maybe wasn't as clear before, and people could just have this shield, and if you didn't have proficiency with it, you could still benefit from it because you technically weren't wielding it. But that isn't the case in 2024. So it's a little sad for spellcasters like wizards and such that don't naturally have proficiency with shields, no longer benefit from an item like this. Moving on to the apparatus of Qualish. This is a two-parter. So in the first part of this, it no longer states that the tail is required to be extended to enable the walk or swim speed of the object. Additionally, interacting with the levers is now the utilize action from just a regular action. So again, Thief, Rogues, Rejoice. If you're ever in a situation where you have access to this item, you're going to be especially good at using it. And then for what the actual levers do, that's on the second part. So there are some small changes with the levers. So for the first lever, the apparatus is no longer described as having a tail, so that's why the tail was removed from the description above. For the sixth lever, it reiterates that the legs must be extended in order for it to move. And then for the seventh lever, it states counterclockwise and clockwise instead of left or right. And then it also reiterates that the legs must be extended to sort of maneuver or turn the apparatus. So not a whole lot of really big changes there. Moving on to the Armor of Gleaming. This was added to the Dungeon Master's Guide from Xanathar's Guide to Everything. This now actually includes light armor, whereas previously this only applied to medium and heavy armor. This is just a common kind of armor that just never gets dirty. I imagine sort of the initial intention with it being called the Armor of Gleaming, that it would be a metal kind of armor that kind of shines and gleams. But they instead, of course, extended it to all kinds of armor for whoever wants it. Moving on then to the Armor of Invulnerability. This now grants resistance to bludgeoning, piercing, and slashing damage, whereas previously this was just non-magical damage. Activating the armor's ability is now a magic action from an action, and this also now provides an additional description of what the armor includes. Previously there was just a picture of what it looks like, and it included all of these things, but adding the actual description of what the armor is made up of is important for the purposes of not doubling up on the same kinds of magic items. For example, it says that it includes a helm, so if you have the Armor of Invulnerability, you can't also have a different magical helm and also be wearing it and benefiting from it. So you couldn't be wearing the Armor of Vulnerability and Gauntlets of Ogre Strength, or you couldn't be wearing, the Armor of Invulnerability and the Boots of Flying. This item kind of takes up all of those slots, so to speak. Moving on to the Armor of Resistance, this one is unchanged. For the Armor of Vulnerability, this can now be any kind of light, medium, or heavy armor, whereas previously this was plate only. This is initially sort of the opposite side of the coin of the Armor of Invulnerability, which can only be plate armor, but the Armor of Vulnerability can now be any kind of armor. Moving on to +1, 2, or 3 armor, these are all unchanged. For the Arrow Catching Shield, this now reiterates the rules around using and benefiting from shields, much like the animated shield as well. Moving on to our first artifact, we have the Axe of the Dwarvish Lords. This is a 3-parter because this is a very long text block. This first section is really just the sort of lore around the artifact. The flavor text now refers to the Star Metal pick from the Brutal pick. And then as we move on to the initial benefits, we can see there's quite a few changes here. This used to also provide the benefits of the Belt of Dwarvenkind, the Dwarven Thrower, and the Sword of Sharpness. Most of the features of each of those items are still here, but some of the features of those items have also been removed. The Axe of the Dwarvish Lords now deals 20s extra slashing damage when you roll a nat 20. Previously, this was part of the Sword of Sharpness, and the Sword of Sharpness specifically does 14 damage, so this now does technically more damage on a natural 20. However, you can no longer cut off a limb if you roll a second natural 20 afterwards, nor can you also use it to shed light the same way that you could with the Sword of Sharpness. So you lose those two features of it, but you now do more damage on a critical hit than you would have before. The additional benefits of the axe also no longer require you to be a dwarf. This is also going to be a pattern that we notice, is that many of the species and alignment requirements of items seem to have been removed in 2024. I haven't gone through all the magic items yet. There might still be some, but the ones that I've seen that used to no longer have those requirements. No longer grants proficiency in the Dwarvish language or advantage on charisma persuasion checks to influence dwarves or Duergar, or the ability to randomly grow a beard from the Belt of Dwarvenkind effect. So still increases your constitution by 2 to a maximum of 20 like the Belt of Dwarvenkind did, but all the other features of that item have been removed from this item. However, it now does grant you proficiency with brewer supplies, mason's tools, and smith's tools. Additionally, it grants you resistance to fire damage, as well as dealing max damage to objects. So far, while there are many things that were sort of lost with this item, I think everything included so far is basically a net positive. Moving on to the final part of the Axe of the Dwarvish Lords, it is a magic action to summon an Earth Elemental, whereas previously this was an action to cast Conjure Elemental for an Earth Elemental. The Elemental takes its turn immediately after you, whereas previously it had its own initiative as per the description of the spell. The Elemental now disappears after 24 hours, whereas previously this was 1 hour with concentration from casting the spell. And you can also now dismiss it as a bonus action. The Travel to the Depths feature is now a magic action from an action, and the weapon now inherits the Topple Mastery because it's a battle axe, and we'll see that sort of pattern a lot with all the different weapons and the magic items as well. I think this one is pretty great. Again, you do have the ability to throw this weapon, and it has the Topple Mastery, so thrown weapon plus Topple Mastery is pretty gross. And if you're level 19 or higher and you have the epic boon of Irresistible Offense, the one that gives you additional damage if you land a critical hit, specifically a natural 20, that combined with this weapon would basically give you a minimum of plus 41 on crits, which is pretty gross, plus your actual weapon damage, plus your other, your strength modifiers and whatever else is going on that weapon. Moving on to Baba Yaga's Dancing Broom. This is actually a new item to the DMG, and again, I covered all the new items in my previous video about all the new items in the Dungeon Master's Guide, so I'm not going to take the time to read it here. For the bag of beans, the bag of beans no longer weighs more for each bean that is put in it. Now it just weighs half a pound. The bag becomes non-magical when it no longer contains any beans. Dumping the beans now says out of the bag, whereas previously this said dumping the beans onto the ground. So maybe this means if you're in like an air fight, you can still dump the beans out and they'll explode around you. Dumping the beans also specifies that all the dumped beans are destroyed in the explosion. I feel like that was pretty implicit before, but now it specifically says that. Exploding beans also now deal force damage, whereas previously this was fire damage, and it also ignited objects that aren't being worn or carried. I do think it's a little weird that it includes the addition of that the bag becomes a non-magical item when it no longer contains any beans. I feel like that was meant to stop it from being reused, but I don't actually feel like it has that effect. Based on the 2014 magic item, I would have assumed that it is the beans inside that are magical, not the bag itself, whereas now it feels like the bag itself is the thing that is magical, and that magic is passed then to the beans inside it. Again, it doesn't say that explicitly, but the fact that it's saying that it's the bag itself that is magical, not the beans inside it, kind of gives me that implication. So that would almost then imply that if you keep putting more beans in it, as long as it never runs out of beans, you could keep using this item, which I don't think that's the intention. I don't think that counts as a good faith reading of the item, but I just found that change interesting because I don't think it does maybe what they thought it did. Moving on to the actual effects of the beans themselves. If you get the geyser, it now lasts for 1d4 minutes, whereas previously this was 1d12 rounds, or basically up to 2 minutes. The tree ant sprouts, you basically had a 50% chance of them being chaotic evil. There's still a 50-50 chance here, but now if they're not chaotic evil, then they're chaotic good. For the result of 41 through 50, you now have 3 Shrieker fungi that sprout, whereas previously this was 1d6 plus 6 Shriekers. So I'm assuming the Shrieker fungi are now a different monster that will be in the new monster manual because, again, there's no link to that creature. It's just bolded text. So that link will probably become active once they put in the new monster manual. For the bright pink toads, you now get 1d4 plus 4 toads, whereas previously this was 1d4 plus 8. It also states now if those toads transform into a random monster, those monsters act in accordance with their alignment or true nature. If you grow a fruit tree, there is no longer one fruit that is defaulted to a type of ingested poison. For the 81 through 90, the eggs are now rainbow colored, if that would matter to you. And then if you happen to grow the pyramid can now also include a mummy or any undead of the DM's choice, whereas previously this was just a mummy lord. So now this gives the DM a little bit more leeway. If this was something that they gave to a low-level party, if they got the pyramid, then they aren't just stuck trying to fight a mummy lord if they accidentally go into it and try to find it. You can scale that encounter to the party's level, which technically you always could as the DM. Of course, you have the power to do that, but now that is more sort of ingrained in the rules of the actual item. Moving on to the Bag of Devouring. The check to escape or remove someone from the bag now benefits from athletics proficiency. And overall, this is just kind of a really fun item. I kind of feel like someone should make a great old one or a similar style of Warlock where they have a Bag of Devouring, and the extra dimensional creature attached to that Bag of Devouring is their patron, and you have this sort of like little shop of horrors sort of motif where you kind of have to keep feeding the bag and maybe tricking creatures into reaching inside it and hoping that they get eaten, things like that. I just think that'd be funny. Moving on to the Bag of Holding. It is now a utilize action to retrieve an item, whereas previously this was an action. So again, Thief Rogues rejoice. Otherwise, there are some small wording changes here, but it's all effectively the same. For the Bag of Tricks, we got a two-parter. It no longer has a stated weight, whereas previously this was half a pound. It is a magic action to retrieve the fuzzy object from an action. The creature pulled from it vanishes at the next dawn or when it's reduced to 0 hit points, whereas previously there was no time limit on the creature. And now it also says that a creature acts immediately after your initiative count, whereas previously this would have had its own initiative. And then if we look at the kinds of creatures that you can pull from this one, there's been no changes. It still contains the exact same kinds of creatures. Moving on to the Bead of Force. Throwing a bead is now a magic action from an action. Again, we're seeing a lot of those kinds of changes. The area of effect is specifically referred to as a sphere, but there's no real mechanical change here. And it is also now a utilize action to push against the force ball from inside, whereas this was previously just an action. Moving on to the Bead of Nourishment and the Bead of Refreshment. These were both added to the DMG from Xanathar's Guide to Everything, but they're otherwise unchanged. For the Belt of Dwarven Kind, knowing Dwarvish is no longer contingent on the wearer not being a dwarf. So if you were a dwarf and you just chose not to take Dwarvish as one of your languages and you put on this belt, then suddenly you would know, your native tongue. The Friend of Dwarven Kind now explicitly extends to Duergar as well, whereas this didn't say that before. The benefits to non-dwarves also now calls out Duergar as well. And finally, Resilience grants advantage on saves to avoid or end the poison condition, whereas previously this was just advantage against poison. I believe that is the same exact effect as it was in 2014. I think they just changed the wording to be more consistent with all of the effects that now avoid or end a certain condition. Moving on to the Belt of Giant Strength, there's no changes here. And then moving on to the Berserker Axe. So the weapon type was changed to a battle axe, great axe, or halberd, whereas previously this was just any axe. You still have disadvantage on attacks with other weapons, even if no foe is within 60 feet of you that you can see or hear. The saving throw is triggered whenever another creature damages you, whereas previously this was just a hostile creature, so if you even take damage from an ally or something like that. You also now specifically regard the creature nearest to you that you can see or hear as an enemy, whereas previously you were just forced to target the nearest creature, but now they are considered an enemy to you, which might be important for certain things that can only target enemies or hostile creatures. The effect now specifically enforces the attack action, whereas previously this was worded just that you just make as many attacks as possible. And then finally, if you have no creatures in range and you need to walk towards the nearest creature, once you've used all your movement, you just immediately end your turn, then you can't do anything else. Moving on to Black Razor. So Black Razor has had a few changes here. It no longer requires attunement by a non-lawful creature. And again, like I said, we're seeing a lot of the specific requirements around species and alignment being removed from magic items. Now grants blind sight for 30 feet, whereas previously this was sensing the presence of tiny or larger creatures that aren't constructs or undead within 60 feet. Having the temporary hit points from devouring a soul no longer grants advantage on all d20 tests. The haste effect now begins at the start of your turn, regardless of when Black Razor casts it. The haste effect is concentration free, whereas previously Black Razor maintained concentration on the spell for you. And if Black Razor decides to end the haste early, it now has to happen at the end of any of your turns. For the second half of this text block, it now includes what actions are necessary to destroy the artifact if you wanted to. It says Black Razor can be destroyed by crushing it in the Great Gears of Mechanus. Primus, the creator of Modron, also knows a series of musical tones that Black Razor can't stand to hear, causing the sword to shatter. And of course, like many of the other magic weapons, they all benefit from the appropriate mastery. So in this case, this is a great sword, so it has the Gray's mastery. Then we have the Book of Exalted Deeds, so we can see that this no longer requires attunement to a good aligned creature. It now seeks to bring guidance to an endangered world, whereas previously this said darkened worlds. Not sure why they changed the wording there. Any creature attuned to the book can open it, whereas previously this was just good aligned creatures who are attuned to it. Specifically, fiends, undead, and servants of gods from the lower planes take damage if they try to read it, whereas previously this was just any evil creature. And if an evil creature attuned to it is destroyed by the damage, the book vanishes and its attunement to it ends. There's the Celestial Calm feature of the Book of Exalted Deeds. This now grants immunity to the Charmed and Frightened condition and resistance to psychic damage while attuned. And then once you've read the book, that effect becomes permanent. The Enlightened Magic feature now affects all spells you cast, whereas previously this was just Cleric or Paladin spells. And then the Halo effect now grants advantage on all Charisma Persuasion checks, whereas previously this was only advantage on those checks with good aligned creatures. Then moving on to the Book of Vile Darkness. Non-fiend, non-undead creatures must make a saving throw if they try to attune to it, whereas previously this only affected non-evil creatures. And if that creature fails that saving throw, they are effectively permanently turned into a larva. Previously they only had their alignment changed to neutral evil. Then it also says that only a wish spell can revert that transformation. Then for the second half of that text, they added the feature called Tireless Form. It says while the book is on your person, you have immunity to the exhaustion condition. Additionally, they added the spells Animate Dead, Circle of Death, and Finger of Death, whereas previously this only included Dominate Monster. There was a feature called Dark Lore that is now renamed Vile Lore. There was like a subsection in the 2014 DMG that was called Vile Lore that included some of the other information in here. But not only was that renamed, but it also now states that whenever you consult the book about intelligence checks to recall information about some sort of aspect of evil evil, you now have advantage on that check. For the vile speech option, it is now a magic action from an action. The language that you speak is no longer named. And then the damage from vile speech does not affect fiends and undead, whereas previously this just affected all non-evil creatures. And then lastly, this no longer states that the book is destroyed forever if all evil in the multiverse is wiped out. The DM could of course still rule that, but maybe this is supposed to imply that, you know, evil technically always exists in some corner, kind of festering and growing, and, you know, eventually it'll resurface again. Notably, the vile lore that gives you advantage on intelligence checks when you refer to the book, you look up something about, you know, something that is evil, that pairs really well with the book rule in the adventuring gear and the player's handbook that says that you get a +5 to an intelligence check when you refer to a nonfiction book about that topic. So if you have this book, then not only do you have advantage on that check, but you also get a +5 bonus to it, in addition to whatever bonuses you might already be applying to that roll. Moving on to the Boots of Elven Kind. This now applies to all dexterity stealth checks, whereas previously this only granted advantage on dexterity stealth checks that relied on moving silently. So if there were ever a situation where that's not the case, you know, rules as written at least, this would apply to any dexterity stealth check. For the Boots of False Tracks, again, this was also added to the Dungeon Master's Guide from Xanathar's Guide to Everything. I forgot to include that here, whereas previously that was a requirement. So you can have any sort of creature wearing these boots, assuming that they can wear boots, and leaving tracks of any sort of other humanoid creature. So kind of maybe a nice item if you're trying to include like a mystery, like a whodunit sort of thing that's leaving false tracks. Pretty cool item. The Boots of Levitation, it no longer states that it's an action to do, but this is implied by the fact that you're casting the spell, because of course the spells require a magic action to do. And it also no longer states that you can do this at will, but again, this is also implied by the permission of the item. The boots don't say that you can cast Levitate on yourself using a spell slot. It just says you can cast Levitate on yourself, period. It doesn't need to say at will. Moving on to Boots of Speed. The only change here is that it now doubles your speed, whereas previously this said your walking speed. For the Boots of Striding and Springing, this now prevents your speed from being reduced by the carrying weight in excess of your carry capacity, whereas previously this said it prevented you from being encumbered. And this also now allows you to jump 30 feet by spending 10 feet of movement, whereas previously this tripled your jump distance, but this distance was still limited to the max amount of movement that you had. I think the old version of this item is interesting, not better, but definitely interesting, because it referenced encumbrance specifically. And encumbrance is specifically a variant or optional rule in the 2014 rules. I think we typically used it to describe being over your carry capacity, but encumbrance itself had its own definition that was more strict than even that. So this was basically a magic item that referenced an optional rule, but it no longer, of course, does that in 2024. And also the whole thing about ignoring being slowed down, being over your carry capacity also is relevant to the video I did on grappling and how carrying capacity could affect the ability to, you know, drag creatures that are grappled by you that are maybe too heavy, especially if you're grabbing multiple creatures. If you had the Boots of Striding and Springing, then technically that also would not be a problem. Moving on to the Boots of the Winterlands. So this now allows you to tolerate temperatures of 0 degrees Fahrenheit or lower without any additional protection. Previously in 2014, this said that you could withstand temperatures as low as -50 degrees, or if you were wearing like heavy, warm winter clothing, you could also withstand up to -100 degrees if you were also wearing these boots. For the Bowl of Commanding Water Elementals, this now requires you to be within 5 feet of the bowl to use it, whereas previously there wasn't a specified restriction. It is now a magic action to activate, whereas previously this required an action with a command word. It now has its own mechanics about how the elemental works, whereas previously you just cast Conjure Elemental specifically for a water elemental. And it also no longer specifies the weight of the bowl, whereas previously this was 3 pounds. For the Bracers of Archery, these are completely unchanged. Similarly, the Bracers of Defense are also unchanged. Then we have the Brazier of Commanding Fire Elementals, similar to the Bowl of Water Elementals. You need to be within 5 feet to activate from no distance. Magic action to activate, whereas previously this was an action requiring a command word. It now simply summons a Fire Elemental, whereas previously you cast Conjure Elemental for the Fire Elemental. And then again, it has specific mechanics about how exactly it works, and it also no longer states the weight of the brazier, whereas previously it was 5 pounds. For the Brooch of Shielding, this is unchanged, although I think it's interesting because this one does give you resistance to force damage, which again, it always did before, but with a lot of force damage resistance being removed from class and subclass features, this might be one of the few ways that you can get resistance to force damage now in 2024. For the Broom of Flying, the weight was removed, whereas previously this was 3 pounds. It is a magic action to activate, whereas previously this was an action with a command word. And now also stops hovering if you're no longer riding it. It is a magic action to cause it to travel alone within a mile, whereas previously this was an action with a command word. And then similarly, it is a magic action to make it come back to you. Previously this was an action, but this now still requires a command word to make it return to you. Moving on to the Candle of Invocation. The candle is now no longer associated with a particular alignment. Lighting the candle is a magic action from an action. It grants you advantage on d20 tests, whereas previously anyone within the light whose alignment matched the alignment of the candle also had advantage on all attack rolls, ability checks, and saving throws. Any cleric or druid in the light can benefit, whereas previously this only benefited clerics or druids whose alignment matched the candle's alignment. It no longer explicitly states that the free spell's effect is as if it were cast at level 1. However, this is covered by other rules that state that free spells are always cast at the lowest level. And also, if you use this to cast the gate spell, the user no longer has control of the destination for the gate spell. It is now chosen by the DM or rolled randomly on the following table. And this is that table for the Candle of Invocation. Moving on to the Candle of the Deep. This was added to the DMG from Xanathar's Guide to Everything, but it is otherwise unchanged. For the Cap of Water Breathing, it is a magic action to activate, whereas previously this was an action that required a command word. And notably, it can no longer be deactivated by a command word. You specifically either have to remove the cap or you're just no longer underwater. For the Cape of Mountebank, this is a magic action to activate, whereas previously this was an action, and it no longer states that a light or stronger wind disperses the smoke that is left behind. For the Carpet of Flying, this is again a magic action to activate from an action, and now it moves according to your directions, whereas previously this said your spoken directions. Arguably, the directions still need to be spoken because it doesn't say that the carpet has telepathy or anything along those lines. For the Cast-Off Armor, this was added to the DMG from Xanathar's Guide to Everything. It is a magic action to activate, whereas previously this was just an action. There's a small typo on D&D Beyond where this screenshot is from, where it just says Armor Common instead of listing the different kinds of armor. But in the Dungeon Master's Guide, the actual physical book, it does say light, medium, or heavy, so this can be any kind of armor. Moving on to the Cauldron of Rebirth. This was added to the DMG from Tasha's Cauldron of Everything. It can be used as a spellcasting focus for your spells, whereas previously this was only druid spells. Notably, this can only be attuned by a druid or a warlock. A warlock can now use this as their spellcasting focus. Creating the Greater Healing Potion now takes 1 minute, whereas previously this didn't take any time. And then causing the cauldron to grow or shrink is now a magic action from an action. For the sensor of controlling air elementals, you now are required to gently swing the sensor, whereas previously you just had to burn incense in it. So basically you need to be holding onto the item and using it in order to activate it. It is a magic action to activate, whereas previously this was an action with a command word. And again, like the brazier and the bowl for the fire and water elementals respectively, you now summon an air elemental, and it has specific rules about how that elemental works. Whereas previously this was casting the conjure elemental spell for the appropriate elemental. And again, much like those items, it no longer states the size or weight of the sensor, whereas previously this was 6 inches wide and 1 foot high, weighing 1 pound. For the Charlatan's Die, this was added to the Dungeon Master's Guide from Xanathar's Guide to Everything, but it's otherwise unchanged. And then the last magic item for this video, at least, is the Chime of Opening. This is now a magic action to use from an action. It now specifically casts the knock spell. Previously, this just opened a single lock or latch on a door, lid, or lock. And it also now replaces the sound from the knock spell with, of course, the sound of a chime, because it is a chime of opening. But it does state now that it is still audible to 300 feet, whereas previously there's no specified distance before. So the Chime of Opening is now a very loud item, at least rules as written. Whereas, again, that wasn't explicit before. It could have been a quieter ring maybe, but now it's definitely very loud because it's the knock spell. So those are all the magic item changes so far. Again, I'm going to continue this series. Everything will be available in a playlist down below. Is there anything here in this video that stood out to you? Any sort of cool interactions that you can think of? I think a lot of the changes to the artifacts, although some things were removed, I think most of them are even more powerful than they were. There are some small nerfs here and there, but I think mostly everything here is fine so far. But again, if there are any cool interactions that I maybe missed or overlooked or just didn't take the time to talk about, again, definitely let me know down in the comments down below. And again, while you're going down to those comments, please hit that like button. If you liked what you saw here and you want to see more, or if you just want to keep up on all these magic item change videos, consider hitting that subscribe button. It helps me out quite a bit. I release videos every Wednesday and Sunday, so you always have something to look forward to. I appreciate all your guys' time, and I'll see you in the next one.